Archvillain Games' recent venture into sci-fi minis, specifically their new Demon Star models, got me thinking about Warhammer, about how I built a massive set of destroyed factory city terrain for it, but never actually play Warhammer. Mostly because I don't like the rules that much, and the games are just too long. But there are plenty of other post-apocalyptic battle games that I could use this set for, some of which could benefit from barricades to use between buildings. Some big, cool fences. I wanted those chunky Jersey barrier style concrete bases, so I got some XPS foam and got to work making the proper shape. For the posts, I'd be using some square lengths of balsa wood, and they would need to be inset into the bases to make a strong connection. Because this particular hard foam takes indentation so well, I was able to just press in the end of the wood pieces to create the appropriate indents. I laid these out so the posts would be evenly spaced with one flush on an end and missing a post on the other end. This way they could butt into each other and create the correct pattern layout. If you're thinking that these foam bases would be too light to support these fences and just want to topple over, you're probably right. But I never planned to use the foam itself. Instead, the plan was to create a silicone mold of these shapes in order to cast them multiple times using resin or plaster. I constantly have comments saying that I should use Lego for making my mold boxes, and I've never done it before. Since this would be a simple rectangle and a fairly shallow pour, I thought, I'll give it a go. In retrospect, I'm not sure that this was any faster than cutting and hot gluing some strips of foam core like I usually do. Actually, I guarantee it took way longer, mostly because it took a while to find enough basic blocks to do it. Eventually I had the walls made and I hot glued around the perimeter to keep it in place and stop the silicone from leaking underneath. This silicone is from Let's Resin. I've only used it once before, but I found it to be great to work with. Very easy to use, so I used it again here. It's a simple 1-to-1 ratio mix by weight and has plenty of working time. I didn't mix enough up initially, so I had to quickly get more mixed and integrated before anything had a chance to start curing. Oh boy, we got a problem. The silicone is leaking through the gaps in the Lego. This is why I don't use Lego. Other people do it, and they say it works. Maybe I should have put tape on it, but what the hell? Look at this. This is brutal. I really hope it hardens up fast enough that it doesn't leak down to the point past the top of the foam there. Because otherwise this will all be useless. Oh boy. Da, 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 da. Oh, Gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay, guys, I think. Yeah, I think it's gonna be all right. This silicone is able to be demolded in a couple hours, but then needs to sit for several more to fully cure before using. The mold turned out great, and the next morning I got to work mixing up some plaster to make the bases. This is Burma plaster, and it cures pretty strong, so it was a decent choice here. I decided to mix in a bit of black acrylic ink to the wet plaster, the idea being that it would look like concrete all the way through if chipped in the future. I wanted the plaster to cure as quickly as possible so I could demold it within like 30 minutes, and I tried out this new heating pad I got. It's designed for exactly this purpose, to heat up molds to speed up curing time, more specifically for resins, but I didn't see why it wouldn't work just as well for plaster. It has a nice silicone mat so that you can get things messy and clean up easily. These long, narrow strips of plaster would be very vulnerable to cracking and snapping. Just like real concrete barriers, they needed some sort of rebar to help with shear strength. I just used one wood dowel in each to do this. The only problem was that it wanted to float to the surface, so I had to set up a bit of weight on top to keep it down embedded in the plaster. With these in place, even if the plaster were to crack, it wouldn't just fall apart into two pieces. These came out of the mold looking absolutely awesome. I was really glad that I mixed in that ink. I had just done it for future chipping issues, but it actually gave me a very realistic concrete look just as is, no painting required. It was time to figure out the height of the posts using some miniatures. And since I have this cool mini out, let's take a second to talk about this video's sponsor, Archvillain Games. If you need some big, chunky, heavily armored demons from hell for your favorite tabletop wargame, well, December Sci-Fi Bundle from Archvillain Games has you covered. It includes over 40 models, ranging in size from 32mm base troops to massive, colossal demon lords and battlefield-destroying machinery. These models all come pre-supported so you can quickly and easily print off as large of an army as you want. How much does it cost for an infinite supply of demon warriors? Only 10 bucks. Yep, that's right, 10 bucks a month gets you a bundle of crazy sci-fi models. And the first month you sign up, you get a bunch of extra free models with their Star Vault collection. If you play wargames, you can't go wrong with this monthly bundle. And if you've been wanting to play wargames but find the cost of models too prohibitive, grab yourself a 3D printer. They have gotten so affordable. Join Archvillain Sci-Fi subscription and print everything you need to get playing. I'll put a link in the description so you can check out more and sign up for yourself. To make these fences look interesting and properly imposing, they needed that iconic Soviet-style angle top bit for razor wire or like electrical wire. I'm sure there's a name for this. I did a simple 45-degree miter cut between the two pieces to make a master of each one. The master could then be used to easily lay out and cut all the pieces. If you find yourself doing something like this, it's really important to mark and only use the masterpiece to lay out every future one. Don't use a copy of a copy of a copy. Don't use a copy to make a copy, or you'll end up with a ton of variation from compound errors. And speaking of errors, I realized I was facing one at this point. Well, not an error, but a problem. I didn't have enough of this size dowel on hand to make all the posts, which is kind of a bummer. I could go out to the store and buy more, but instead I chose to use a slightly larger size that I did have enough of. The holes actually turned out a little loose for the initial size, so this worked out just fine. I just had to start all over again by laying out and cutting more pieces. I glued them together with wood glue as that would make the strongest bond. And to speed up the glue drying time, I did this on the heating pad. This thing is proving itself pretty useful. Once dry enough, the excess glue could be cut off and the joints reinforced with some super glue just for good measure. I wanted a couple of lines of electric wire running across the tops, so I marked out the layout for 3 of them and used a tiny triangle file to cut tiny grooves for the wire. The hope here is that it would make gluing the wire in place a lot easier. I realized that my post layout worked well in terms of symmetry, but that I'd have nothing to support the last section of fencing mesh or wire, and I couldn't think of a solution to that other than just putting another post at each end. This would cause a doubling up effect when placed next to each other, but it was crucial to making these things actually work. After making 2 extra posts, I also had to carve in the notches for them in the bases. Thankfully, the plaster wasn't fully cured yet, so I was able to do this relatively easily using an X-Acto blade. I figured I should also play it safe and add cross bracing at the top and bottom to give me more stability and mounting points for the fence mesh. The smaller balsa would have worked really well for this, but I still didn't have enough of it, so instead I turned to some paper straws for the top rail and some cake popper sticks for the bottom ones. For the chain link fencing, I used a metal mesh window screen. The plastic kind would work just fine, look the same in the end, and be a lot easier to deal with, but I wanted that extra strength of the metallic screen. The metal stuff is also a good option if you don't want to paint it. It would have been great if I had some of this in flat sheets so I didn't have to fight with the curl, but working with it as is, I ended up just gluing all the surfaces of the frames, placing them on the mesh at a 45-degree angle to the screen pattern, then placing something flat with some weight on top to hopefully hold everything together nicely while the glue dried. This worked out alright, and once the glue was set, I was able to cut off the extra screen. Because the bases looked like concrete already, I didn't want to paint them, so I primed and painted the fence sections on their own. And while the primer dried, I looked at the plaster bases and thought, they could be a bit darker and use some extra strength. So I mixed up some gloss Mod Podge with a fair bit of water and a bit of black ink. This applied beautifully and was thin enough that it soaked right into the plaster, which is exactly what I wanted. After the first coat dried, I thought it could go a bit darker, and it looked like the plaster wasn't fully sealed and would absorb more. So I applied a second coat with even more black ink mixed in. This really made them look perfect. The fence sections were painted with a simple metallic dry brush. I didn't quite like how this paint looked though, and there were some sections of excess glue clogging up the mesh that looked kind of crappy. I tried to hide this using some deep down rust effect. This stuff is so good and very realistic looking. My problem with it is that I can never seem to stop after just applying a minimal amount and end up coating basically all metal surfaces with it. Since these were meant to work with my very rusty Plague City buildings, this would be fine. But I think that a non-rusty version would look really nice in a more modern, clean, futuristic setting. Now for the electric wires. I have a variety of jewelry wire that I keep on hand for this sort of stuff, and it's so perfect for scale use. I had used some of this wire in the past on the Plague City buildings to create power lines. I have to admit, this was a lot trickier to get glued in place than I had expected, even with my grooves. This wire is easy to use when you can wrap it around an object before gluing and kind of like pull it tight, but with only 2 hands, it's pretty tricky to pull it tight and glue flat. I did somehow manage to get there in the end though. One slight issue remaining were some of the gaps between the bases and the poles. As a quick fix, I mixed up some texture paste with some black ink to create a similar gray color as the bases, and I just filled in the spots and smoothed them out. This blended quite well with the plaster and would be flexible and strong long term. All in all, I think these fence sections look awesome, and I'm glad that I made the silicone molds so that I can cast more in the future that perfectly match. This was still a very tedious build though. If I want to make a lot of them, I'll need to find a way to quickly make the fence posts in bulk. I think molding them as one piece and then casting them in resin might be the way to go. I hope you enjoyed this video and found something helpful in it. Don't forget to give this video a like, comment, and a share, as this all really helps it to get seen by more people on the platform. If you want to grab the silicone I used or the sponsor's cool minis, I'll have links in the description. And for all other hobby shopping, consider using my affiliate links on blackmagicraft.ca to help keep this channel going. Of course, if you want to help out the channel in the biggest way possible, you can join the Black Magic Craft Fellowship on Patreon. I'd love to see you there, and it really does help me keep making these videos. Until next time, happy crafting, cheers.